The sound that would change everything wasn't the roar of gunfire or the crash of breaking glass. It was something far more chilling, the trembling voice of a seasoned palace guard, a man who had served 3 monarchs and witnessed 2 world wars, whispering into his radio with terror in his voice. Code red. Immediate breach. All units to the East Wing, now. In the span of 60 seconds, what began as another ordinary Tuesday morning at the royal residence would spiral into a crisis that would test the very foundations of palace security, challenge the courage of a man named William, and reveal secrets that had been buried for decades within those ancient walls. This is the true story of how one guard's desperate plea would force an ordinary citizen to make an extraordinary choice, to storm through doors that had remained sealed for generations, uncovering a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power and changed the course of royal history forever. William Matthews had no intention of becoming a hero that Tuesday morning. At 42 years old, he was a maintenance supervisor for the royal estates, a man who preferred the quiet company of ancient boilers and temperamental heating systems to the glamorous world that existed beyond the service corridors of the palace. His calloused hands and weathered face told the story of 20 years spent keeping the massive complex running smoothly, invisible to the dignitaries and royals who walked the polished floors above. The morning of September 15th began like any other. William arrived at 6:30 sharp, his thermos of black coffee still steaming as he made his way through the maze of underground passages that connected the various wings of the palace. These tunnels, built during the war as bomb shelters, had become his domain. He knew every pipe, every electrical junction, every hidden door that the architects had cleverly concealed within the walls. The East Wing had been giving him trouble for weeks. The heating system installed in the 1920s was showing its age. Radiators clanged mysteriously in the night, and the temperature fluctuated wildly despite his constant adjustments. The wing housed the royal archives, thousands of documents and artifacts that required precise climate control. Any damage from temperature swings could destroy centuries of history. As William descended the narrow staircase to the sub-basement, he noticed something unusual. The door to the East Wing mechanical room, which he had locked the previous evening, stood slightly ajar. A thin sliver of light escaped from within, casting an unnatural glow on the stone walls. He paused, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy flashlight clipped to his belt. In his 2 decades of service, William had developed an almost supernatural sense for when things were wrong. The palace was a living entity to him, with its own rhythms and sounds. This morning, something was off. The usual hum of machinery seemed muted, replaced by an odd vibration that he felt more than heard. He approached the door carefully, his work boots silent on the concrete floor. Through the gap, he could see that someone had been in his mechanical room. Toolboxes had been moved, and strange equipment he didn't recognize sat on his workbench. Most disturbing of all, the main heating control panel had been opened, its complex array of switches and gauges exposed. William's mind raced. Who could have accessed this area? The mechanical rooms were restricted, accessible only to essential personnel with the highest security clearances. Even he had to submit to daily background checks and carry multiple identification cards. The idea that someone could simply walk into his domain was unthinkable. As he pushed the door open wider, the smell hit him first. It wasn't the familiar scent of oil and metal that usually filled the mechanical spaces. This was something chemical, sharp and acrid, like the cleaning solutions they used in the palace laboratories. But there were no laboratories in the East Wing. Only the archives and a few rarely used guest quarters. The source of the smell became clear as William stepped into the room. Someone had been working with the building's ventilation system, specifically the air circulation that served the archive levels above. Tubes and containers filled with an unidentified liquid were connected to the main air intake. A small pump hummed quietly, slowly feeding the mysterious substance into the system that would carry it throughout the East Wing. William's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. Someone was deliberately contaminating the air supply to the archives. But this wasn't random vandalism or even theft. The equipment was too sophisticated, too precisely calibrated. This was the work of professionals, people who understood exactly what they were doing. His hand trembling slightly, William reached for his radio. Palace protocol was clear about security breaches, but this went beyond anything covered in the standard procedures. He was looking at what could only be described as an attack on the palace itself, possibly targeting the priceless documents and artifacts stored in the archives above. The radio crackled to life as he pressed the emergency channel. "Control, this is Matthews in East Wing Mechanical. I need security down here immediately. We have a situation." The response was immediate but unexpected. Instead of the calm, professional voice of the security dispatcher, William heard something that chilled him to the bone. It was Guard Captain Harrison, a man William had known for 15 years, and Harrison's voice was filled with barely controlled panic. "William, thank God. Listen to me very carefully. Do not touch anything in that room. Do not let anyone else enter. We have a Code Red situation developing, and you may have stumbled into the middle of it." Code Red was the highest level of emergency at the palace, reserved for threats to royal safety or national security. In all his years of service, William had never heard it used for anything more serious than a false alarm or a minor security glitch. "Captain, what's going on?" "There's some kind of chemical equipment down here, connected to the ventilation system. Someone's been pumping something into the air supply." The silence on the radio seemed to stretch forever before Harrison's voice returned, even more strained than before. "William, I need you to listen very carefully. What you've discovered may be connected to something much larger than we initially realized. We've been tracking unusual activity in the East Wing for the past week, but we couldn't pinpoint the source." William's mind reeled. Security had known something was wrong and hadn't told him? He was responsible for every mechanical system in the building, and they had kept him in the dark about a potential threat to his own workplace. "Why wasn't I informed, Captain?" "This is my area of responsibility." "Because we didn't know who we could trust," Harrison admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "William, we have reason to believe that someone with high-level access has been compromising palace security. Someone who knows our procedures, our schedules, our weaknesses." The implications of Harrison's words began to sink in. An inside job. Someone within the palace staff, possibly someone William worked with daily, had been planning this attack. The friendly faces he passed in the corridors, the colleagues he shared coffee with in the break room, one of them could be a traitor. "What do you need me to do, Captain?" "First, I need you to document everything you see. Take pictures if you can, but don't touch the equipment. We'll need evidence of what they were trying to do." William pulled out his phone and began photographing the setup. The chemical containers, the pump system, the connections to the ventilation. Each image revealed new details about the sophistication of the operation. This wasn't the work of amateurs. Whoever had done this understood the palace's infrastructure as well as William did himself. As he worked, a new sound caught his attention. Footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system. Multiple sets of feet, moving quickly and purposefully. They weren't coming from the direction of the main service entrance, but from the older passages that connected to the archive building. "Captain, I'm hearing movement in the tunnels." Multiple people heading this way. Harrison's response was immediate and urgent. "Get out of there now, William. Use the emergency exit and meet me at checkpoint 7. But as William turned toward the door he had entered through, he heard the distinctive sound of it slamming shut, followed by the mechanical click of an electronic lock engaging. He was trapped in the mechanical room with unknown individuals approaching from the opposite direction. "Captain, they've locked me in. The main door is sealed." The radio crackled with static before Harrison's voice returned, filled with grim determination. "William, there's something I haven't told you. The reason we've been tracking activity in the East Wing isn't just about security. 3 days ago, we discovered that someone has been accessing the most sensitive documents in the Royal Archives. Documents that could compromise national security if they fell into the wrong hands. William's situation had just become infinitely more complicated. He wasn't just dealing with vandalism or even a simple attack on the palace. He was trapped in the middle of what appeared to be a sophisticated espionage operation. The footsteps were getting closer, and William could now hear voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably professional, military even. These weren't common criminals or political protesters. These were trained operatives. "Captain, what exactly is in those archives that someone would go to these lengths to access?" Harrison's answer came slowly, as if he was weighing each word carefully. "William, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. The East Wing archives contain more than historical documents. There are files there that detail current intelligence operations, diplomatic communications, and security protocols for all royal residences. The full scope of the crisis began to dawn on William. Someone wasn't just trying to steal historical artifacts or embarrass the royal family. They were after information that could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and potentially put lives at risk. Captain, I need options. There has to be another way out of here. There is, but it's going to require you to do something that goes against every security protocol we have. There's an emergency access tunnel that runs from your location directly to the archive building. It was sealed decades ago, but the mechanism should still work. William knew the tunnel Harrison was referring to. It was marked on the original blueprints as a fire escape route, but it had been deemed too much of a security risk and permanently closed in the 1970s. Opening it would create a direct path from the mechanical areas to one of the most secure parts of the palace. Captain, opening that tunnel could compromise the security of the archives. William, I think the archives are already compromised. We need to know what they've taken and what they're planning to do with it. You're our only chance to get into that building without alerting whoever is orchestrating this operation. The voices in the tunnel were getting closer, and William could now distinguish at least 3 different speakers. They were moving with purpose, heading directly toward his location. In a matter of minutes, they would reach the mechanical room, and he would be face to face with whoever was behind this operation. Tell me about this tunnel, Captain. It's behind the main electrical panel on the north wall. There should be a hidden release mechanism, probably a lever or a concealed switch. The tunnel itself is about 200 feet long and comes up in the basement of the archive building. William located the electrical panel and began examining it for any signs of a hidden mechanism. His fingers traced along the edges of the metal housing, feeling for anything that might give way under pressure. After several tense moments, he found it, a small lever concealed behind a false backing plate. As he prepared to activate the tunnel, William realized that he was about to cross a line that would change everything. Once he opened that passage, he would no longer be just a maintenance worker who had stumbled onto a security breach. He would be actively involved in a counterintelligence operation that could have international implications. The voices were now close enough that he could make out individual words. Professional terminology, code names, references to timetables and extraction procedures. These people were definitely not palace staff, and their presence confirmed that this was a carefully planned operation. William pulled the lever. The hidden panel swung open with surprising ease, revealing a narrow tunnel that stretched into absolute darkness. The air that escaped from within was stale and cold, carrying with it the musty scent of decades of abandonment. William hesitated for just a moment, listening as the voices in the main tunnel grew louder and more distinct. He could now hear them discussing time frames and discussing something about Phase 2 completion. With no other choice, William squeezed through the opening and pulled the panel closed behind him. The darkness was complete and overwhelming, forcing him to rely on the small flashlight attached to his maintenance belt. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing a tunnel that was smaller than he had expected, with rough stone walls that wept with moisture, and a floor covered in decades of accumulated debris. As he began to make his way forward, William could hear the muffled sounds of the intruders reaching the mechanical room he had just escaped. Their voices carried through the walls, distorted but still audible. They were speaking in English but with accents he couldn't quite place. Professional, clipped, efficient. The tunnel was a testament to the palace's complex history. William could see evidence of different construction periods in the varying stonework and architectural details. Some sections dated back centuries, while others showed clear signs of more recent modifications. Electrical conduits had been installed along the walls at some point, though the wires within had long since deteriorated. Progress was slow and treacherous. The floor was uneven, littered with chunks of fallen masonry and pools of stagnant water that had accumulated over the decades. More than once, William had to squeeze through sections where the walls had shifted, narrowing the passage to barely shoulder width. About halfway through the tunnel, his flashlight beam illuminated something that made him stop cold. Fresh footprints in the accumulated dust and debris. Someone else had used this passage recently, and judging by the clarity of the impressions, it had been within the past few days. William knelt down to examine the prints more closely. There were at least 2 sets, both wearing heavy boots with distinctive tread patterns. The prints led in both directions, suggesting that whoever had made them had been using the tunnel regularly. traveling back and forth between the mechanical areas and the archive building. The implications were staggering. The tunnel that was supposed to have been permanently sealed for security reasons had been compromised for some time. Someone with access to the original building plans and the knowledge to locate the hidden mechanisms had been using it as a secret route into the most secure areas of the palace. As William continued forward, he noticed other signs of recent activity: scrape marks on the walls where equipment had been carried through, and small pieces of modern debris that definitely didn't belong in an abandoned tunnel. Whoever had been using this passage had been moving substantial amounts of material. His radio crackled to life, Harrison's voice barely audible through the interference caused by the thick stone walls. "William, can you hear me? We've lost contact with the East Wing security station. I need to know your status." William pressed the radio close to his mouth and spoke as quietly as possible. "I'm in the tunnel, Captain. About halfway through. But there's something you need to know. This passage has been used recently. There are fresh footprints and signs that someone's been moving equipment through here." The silence that followed was long and ominous. When Harrison finally responded, his voice carried a weight of realization that sent a chill down William's spine. "That explains how they've been accessing the archives without triggering our security systems." "William, this is worse than we thought. If they've been using that tunnel, they could have been operating inside the archive building for weeks without our knowledge." The tunnel began to slope upward, and William could sense that he was approaching the other end. The air was becoming slightly fresher, suggesting that there might be some kind of ventilation or opening ahead. His flashlight beam picked out the outline of another panel, similar to the one he had used to enter the passage. As he approached the exit, William could hear new sounds filtering through the walls. Machinery, voices, and the occasional electronic beep that suggested sophisticated equipment was operating nearby. Whatever was happening in the archive building, it was far more extensive than a simple break-in. William paused at the exit panel, listening carefully to try to determine what lay beyond. The voices were muffled but continuous, suggesting multiple people engaged in some kind of coordinated activity. There was an urgency to their conversations that implied they were working against a deadline. "Captain, I'm at the archive building, end of the tunnel." "What?" "I can hear activity on the other side, multiple people operating some kind of equipment. Can you determine how many people we're dealing with?" William pressed his ear against the panel, trying to distinguish individual voices, at least 4, possibly more. They're definitely not palace staff, and they sound like they're conducting some kind of technical operation. "William, I need you to be very careful here. We still don't know the full extent of their capabilities or their intentions. Can you see anything through the panel?" William examined the exit mechanism and discovered that the panel had a small observation port, probably intended for security purposes when the tunnel was originally constructed. Peering through the tiny opening, he could see into what appeared to be the basement storage area of the archive building. What he saw made his blood run cold. The basement had been transformed into a sophisticated operational center. Multiple computer workstations had been set up, connected by cables to equipment that William didn't recognize but that looked distinctly military in nature. Documents were spread across tables, many of them bearing the distinctive seals and markings of classified government materials. 4 individuals dressed in dark clothing moved efficiently between the workstations, photographing documents and transferring data to portable storage devices. The operation was methodical and professional, suggesting that these people had extensive experience in intelligence gathering. Most disturbing of all, William could see that they had gained access to the archive storage areas above. Document boxes that should have been secured in climate-controlled vaults were stacked around the room, their contents being systematically photographed and catalogued. "Captain, this isn't just a break-in. They've turned the basement into an intelligence collection center. They're photographing classified documents and transferring data to portable devices. This has been going on for a while." Harrison's response was grim. "We need to know what they've accessed and whether they're planning to destroy evidence of their presence. Can you get closer to see what specific documents they're working with?" William studied the layout of the room through the observation port. The exit from the tunnel would place him behind a large support column, providing some concealment but also limiting his options if he needed to escape quickly. The operatives were focused on their work, but they moved with the alertness of people trained to detect threats. "I can get a better view, but if they spot me, I'll be trapped. There's no other way out of that room except back through this tunnel." William, I'm going to ask you to do something that goes against every instinct you have. I need you to document what they're doing. Take pictures if you can, but more importantly, try to identify what materials they're accessing. We need to know the scope of this breach. William understood the gravity of what Harrison was asking. He would be moving from passive observer to active intelligence gathering, putting himself at significant personal risk. But the alternative, allowing foreign operatives to complete their mission unopposed, was unacceptable. Carefully, William opened the exit panel just wide enough to allow him to slip through. The opening was concealed behind the support column, but he would still need to be extremely careful to avoid detection. The basement was larger than it had appeared through the observation port, with multiple rooms and storage areas that could provide additional cover. As his eyes adjusted to the brighter lighting in the basement, William could see more details of the operation. The documents spread across the tables included diplomatic correspondence, intelligence briefings, and what appeared to be operational plans for current security protocols. If these materials fell into the wrong hands, they could compromise ongoing operations and put lives at risk. Moving as quietly as possible, William positioned himself where he could observe the main work area, while remaining hidden behind storage cabinets. He began taking pictures with his phone, documenting the setup, and trying to capture clear images of the documents being processed. One of the operatives, a woman with short dark hair and efficient movements, was working with a section of documents that made William's heart race. They were architectural plans and security protocols for all royal residences, including detailed information about emergency procedures and safe room locations. This information could be used to plan attacks on any of the royal properties. As William continued to document the operation, he became aware that the team was preparing to conclude their activities. Equipment was being disconnected and packed into specialized cases, and the documents were being returned to their original storage containers. They were covering their tracks, preparing to disappear as completely as they had appeared. The realization hit William like a physical blow. If these operatives completed their mission and escaped, there might be no evidence that this breach had ever occurred. The compromised information would be in enemy hands, but the palace security would have no way of knowing which specific materials had been exposed. He had to act. William knew that his next decision would define not only his own future, but potentially the security of the nation itself. He could retreat through the tunnel and report what he had seen, allowing the operatives to escape but preserving evidence of their activities. Or he could try to prevent their escape, knowing that he was vastly outnumbered and untrained for this type of confrontation. The choice was taken away from him when one of the operatives looked directly at his hiding place. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, William and the operative stared at each other across the basement room. The man's hand moved slowly toward what was clearly a concealed weapon, while his expression remained professionally calm. William realized that his period of passive observation had ended. The operation had detected his presence, and his options had suddenly become very limited and very dangerous. The basement that had been filled with the quiet sounds of professional intelligence gathering suddenly became charged with tension as the operative raised his hand to alert his colleagues without taking his eyes off William's position. In that moment, William Matthews, maintenance supervisor and keeper of boilers, had to become something else entirely. The operative's hand signal was subtle but effective. Within seconds, the entire team had shifted into defensive positions without creating any obvious alarm. Their movements were fluid and coordinated, the kind of choreography that only came from extensive training and experience working together. William remained frozen behind the storage cabinet, his mind racing through possibilities. The tunnel entrance was 20 feet away, but reaching it would require crossing open ground where he would be completely exposed. The basement had other exits, but he had no way of knowing whether they led to freedom or into the hands of additional operatives. The man who had spotted him was advancing slowly, using the equipment tables and storage containers as cover. His weapon remained concealed, but his posture left no doubt about his intentions. This was someone accustomed to dealing with unexpected complications in a professional and permanent manner. William's radio crackled softly, Harrison's voice barely audible through the static. "William, report your status. We're detecting some kind of electronic jamming in your area." The mention of electronic jamming provided William with a crucial piece of information. The operatives weren't just stealing documents. They had the capability to interfere with palace communication systems. This suggested a level of technical sophistication that went far beyond a simple intelligence-gathering mission. As the operative continued to approach, William noticed something that gave him a spark of hope. The man was moving carefully around the electrical equipment that powered the basement lighting and climate control systems. Professional training had taught him to avoid unnecessary risks to the mission-critical infrastructure. William knew those systems intimately. Every cable, every junction box, every emergency shutoff was part of his daily responsibility. If he could reach the main electrical panel, he might be able to create enough confusion to escape, or, at minimum, disrupt the ongoing operation. The panel was mounted on the wall about 15 feet from his current position, but reaching it would require exposing himself completely. William weighed his options and realized that waiting would only allow the operatives to surround his position more completely. Taking a deep breath, William burst from his hiding place and sprinted toward the electrical panel. The basement erupted into controlled chaos as the operatives responded to his sudden movement. Shouts and what sounded like Russian filled the air, along with the rapid footsteps of people moving to intercept his path. William's years of maintenance work had given him an intimate knowledge of the building's layout that the operatives lacked. As he ran, he knocked over storage containers and equipment cases, creating obstacles for his pursuers while navigating through the maze of basement storage areas. A sharp crack echoed through the basement as one of the operatives fired a weapon equipped with a silencer. The bullet struck the wall inches from William's head, sending chips of concrete flying. The message was clear. They were willing to use lethal force to protect their operation. William reached the electrical panel and yanked open the access door, revealing the complex array of switches and circuit breakers that controlled power throughout the archive building. Without hesitation, he began throwing breakers, plunging sections of the basement into darkness, and cutting power to the climate control systems that protected the precious documents stored above. The immediate effect was dramatic. Emergency lighting activated, casting eerie red shadows throughout the basement, while alarm systems began wailing as the climate control systems detected the power failure. More importantly, the loss of power forced the operatives' equipment to switch to battery backup, limiting their operational capabilities. In the confusion of the alarm systems and emergency lighting, William saw his chance. The tunnel entrance was now accessible, and the operatives were temporarily focused on securing their equipment rather than pursuing him. But as he moved toward the tunnel, William realized he had created a much larger problem. The power failure would trigger automatic security protocols throughout the palace complex. Within minutes, security teams would be responding to what they would initially assume was a routine system malfunction. They would walk directly into the middle of an active espionage operation. His radio crackled with Harrison's urgent voice. "William, we're showing multiple system failures in the archive building. What's your situation?" "Captain, I've shut down the power to disrupt their operation, but they're armed and extremely dangerous. You need to keep security teams away from this building until you have a plan to deal with professional operatives." The woman operative William had observed earlier was now speaking rapidly into a communication device, apparently coordinating with external support. The team was adapting to the changed circumstances with the kind of flexibility that suggested extensive contingency planning. William realized that his actions had escalated the situation beyond a covert intelligence operation. The operatives would now have to decide whether to abort their mission or eliminate the witnesses and complete their objectives through force. As if reading his thoughts, the team leader began issuing orders that chilled William to the bone. They were not retreating. Instead, they were implementing what sounded like a secondary operational plan that involved securing the building and eliminating any potential witnesses. "Captain, they're not withdrawing. They're switching to some kind of secondary plan. I think they're planning to eliminate evidence of their presence, including anyone who might have witnessed their activities." Harrison's response was grim. "William, we're mobilizing armed response teams, but it will take time to coordinate a safe approach. These people are obviously professionals, and we can't risk a confrontation that might result in casualties among palace staff or damage to the archives." As William prepared to escape through the tunnel, one of the operatives called out to him in accented English. "Mr. Matthews, yes, we know who you are. There is no need for anyone to be hurt today. We are simply recovering some materials that belong to our government. Walk away, and this incident never happened." The offer was tempting, but William understood the implications. These people had done their homework. They knew his name, his position, probably his background and family situation. If he walked away, they would complete their mission and disappear. But they would also have his identity and could find him later if they decided he represented a security risk. More importantly, William had seen too much. He knew what documents they had accessed, what equipment they were using, and how they had penetrated palace security. They couldn't afford to leave him alive with that information. Matthews, you have 30 seconds to make a decision. William used those 30 seconds to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. Instead of fleeing through the tunnel, he began moving deeper into the basement storage areas, toward the archive vaults that held the most sensitive materials. If the operatives wanted to eliminate witnesses and complete their mission, they would have to follow him into the maze of storage rooms and document vaults that he knew better than anyone alive. He was changing the battlefield to one where his knowledge of the facility gave him an advantage over their professional training. The chase through the basement became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with William using his intimate knowledge of the building to stay ahead of his pursuers while leading them away from both their equipment and their planned escape routes. As he moved through the storage areas, William began to understand the full scope of what the operatives had been doing. Document containers that should have been sealed were open, their contents disturbed. File cabinets had been accessed, their locking mechanisms defeated with professional precision. But most disturbing of all, William discovered that the operatives had been selective in their activities. They hadn't randomly stolen documents. They had targeted specific categories of materials. Intelligence reports, diplomatic communications, and security protocols had been prioritized, while historical documents and ceremonial records had been ignored. This wasn't a fishing expedition. Someone had provided the operatives with detailed information about what materials were stored in the archive building and where to find them. They had inside knowledge that could only have come from someone with legitimate access to the archive system. As William reached the deepest level of the storage areas, he found himself in the vault that contained the most sensitive current intelligence materials. The massive steel door stood open, its sophisticated locking mechanism obviously compromised by professional tools. Inside the vault, William discovered the true scope of the breach. Files containing information about ongoing intelligence operations had been photographed, diplomatic cables had been copied, and security protocols for all government facilities had been compromised. The implications were staggering. If this information reached hostile intelligence services, it could compromise ongoing operations and put intelligence assets around the world at risk. William's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Harrison. All units, we have confirmed hostile operatives in the archive building. This is now a national security incident. Military support has been requested. The mention of military support changed everything. What had begun as a maintenance call had escalated into a situation that threatened national security. William found himself at the center of an international incident that could have far-reaching consequences. As he heard the operatives approaching the vault area, William realized that his time was running out. They had followed him into the deepest part of the archive storage, far from their equipment and escape routes, but they were also closing in on his position. The vault where William now stood represented the heart of the nation's intelligence capabilities. If the operatives gained complete access to these materials, the damage to national security could be irreparable. Standing among the filing cabinets and document storage systems that represented decades of intelligence work, William faced the most important decision of his life. He could attempt to escape and hope that authorities could limit the damage, or he could make a stand and try to prevent the operatives from completing their mission. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the vault as the operatives closed in on his position. In moments, they would round the corner and find him standing in the heart of the nation's most sensitive intelligence archives. William looked around the vault one last time, taking in the thousands of documents and files that represented so much more than paper and ink. These materials represented the safety and security of his country, the lives of intelligence assets around the world, and the preservation of democratic institutions. The footsteps were getting closer. William made his choice. William's choice was as desperate as it was decisive. Instead of hiding or attempting to escape, he moved to the vault's central control station and began activating the emergency destruction protocols that were built into the most sensitive archive storage systems. If the operatives wanted access to the nation's intelligence secrets, they would have to stop him before he could destroy the very materials they had come to steal. The control station was a relic from the Cold War era, designed to allow authorized personnel to destroy sensitive documents in the event of imminent capture by hostile forces. William had been briefed on its existence but had never imagined he would need to use it. The system required multiple authentication steps and manual confirmation, designed to prevent accidental activation. As alarms began to sound throughout the vault, indicating that the destruction sequence had been initiated, the approaching footsteps suddenly accelerated. The operatives realized what William was attempting and understood that their entire mission was now at risk. The first operative to reach the vault was the woman William had observed earlier. She appeared at the entrance with her weapon drawn, her face showing the cold professionalism of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations. "Step away from the controls, Mr. Matthews. There is no need for anyone to die today, but I will not allow you to destroy materials that my government requires." William's hands continued to work through the destruction sequence, each step bringing the system closer to the point of no return. "Your government has no legal claim to these materials. You're stealing classified information that could get people killed. You have a very simple view of international relations, Mr. Matthews. These documents contain information about activities that have already gotten my people killed. We are simply balancing the scales." The exchange revealed something crucial about the operatives' motivation. This wasn't random espionage or simple intelligence gathering. They were after specific information related to operations that had affected their own personnel. Someone in their organization believed that the materials in these archives contained evidence of activities that had resulted in the deaths of their agents or assets. As William reached the final confirmation step in the destruction sequence, 2 more operatives entered the vault, positioning themselves to cut off any potential escape routes. The tension in the room was palpable as both sides faced the prospect of an irreversible escalation. "Mr. Matthews," the woman continued, "you are thinking like a maintenance worker, not like someone who understands the complexities of international intelligence operations. The materials you are protecting may document actions that violated international law." William paused, his finger hovering over the final confirmation button. The woman's words carried an undertone of conviction that suggested she genuinely believed in the righteousness of her mission. But conviction didn't change the fact that she was attempting to steal classified materials from a sovereign nation. "Even if that's true," William replied, "this isn't the way to address it. There are diplomatic channels, legal procedures, international courts. Breaking into archives and stealing documents is an act of war. Tell that to the families of the agents who died because of the operations documented in those files." The emotional weight behind her words was unmistakable, but William understood that he was hearing only one side of a complex story. Intelligence operations were messy, morally ambiguous affairs where the full truth was rarely simple or one-sided. His radio crackled with Harrison's voice, now accompanied by the background noise of multiple vehicles and personnel. "William, military units are taking positions around the archive building. We need to know your exact location and the status of the hostiles." William realized that his actions had triggered a massive response. Military units surrounding the building meant that the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The operatives would now be trapped inside the archive building, cut off from their extraction routes, and facing the prospect of capture, or worse. "Captain, I'm in the main vault with 4 hostiles. They're armed but haven't fired. I've initiated the emergency destruction protocols for the most sensitive materials." The silence that followed his transmission was ominous. William understood that he had just announced his intention to destroy materials that might be critical to ongoing intelligence operations. Even in the name of protecting national security, his actions would have far-reaching consequences. One of the male operatives spoke for the first time, his English carrying a slight accent that William now recognized as Eastern European. "Your military response has changed the situation significantly, Mr. Matthews. We came here to retrieve information quietly. Now we are faced with capture, and likely torture." The word torture hung in the air like a physical presence. William realized that these operatives were facing the prospect of falling into the hands of military interrogators who would use any means necessary to extract information about their mission, their organization, and their government's intelligence capabilities. "Surrender," William said. "You'll be treated according to international law." The operative's laugh was bitter and knowing. International law is a luxury for people who have not experienced the reality of intelligence warfare, Mr. Matthews. We know what happens to foreign operatives who are captured during missions like this. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of heavy vehicles and shouted military commands could be heard filtering through the building above them. The archive building was now surrounded by armed forces who had been told that foreign operatives had penetrated one of the nation's most sensitive facilities. The woman operative looked at William with something that might have been respect. "You have forced us all into an impossible situation, Mr. Bruce Matthews. We cannot complete our mission, we cannot escape, and we cannot surrender. You have created a scenario where violence becomes inevitable." William felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. His decision to initiate the destruction protocols had been intended to protect national security, but it had also trapped everyone in the vault in an increasingly dangerous situation. "There has to be another option," he said. "Perhaps," the woman replied, "but it would require trust between people who have every reason to distrust each other." The destruction sequence continued to count down, each passing second bringing the system closer to the point where the most sensitive documents would be irretrievably destroyed. But William realized that the physical destruction of documents might be less important than understanding why these operatives had been willing to risk so much to obtain them. "Tell me what you're really after," he said, his finger still hovering over the abort button. "Justice for operations that your government will never acknowledge, and families who will never receive official notification of how their loved ones died." The emotional conviction in her voice was unmistakable, and William found himself facing a moral complexity he had never anticipated. If these operatives were telling the truth about the contents of the archives, then the documents he was protecting might indeed contain evidence of activities that violated international law and human rights principles. But even if that were true, he couldn't simply hand over classified materials to foreign operatives. The information contained in the archives represented far more than evidence of past operations. It included current intelligence that could affect ongoing missions and put lives at risk. His radio crackled again, this time with a new voice, someone with clear military authority. "This is Colonel Richardson, Military Intelligence. Mr. Matthews, we need you to maintain your position and avoid any actions that might compromise the materials under your protection." The colonel's words carried an implicit threat. William was being instructed to protect the archives, even at the cost of his own safety. The military authorities outside were prepared to treat the operatives as enemy combatants, which meant that negotiation and surrender might not be realistic options. William looked at the operatives, seeing them not as faceless enemies, but as people trapped in an impossible situation by circumstances beyond their control. They had families, beliefs, and motivations that were just as real and valid as his own, even if their methods were questionable. "What if we could find a middle ground?" he asked. The woman operative studied his face carefully. "What did you have in mind, Mr. Matthews? You say you're looking for evidence of specific operations that resulted in the deaths of your people. What if we could verify those claims through official channels? What if there was a way to get justice without stealing classified materials? Your government would never acknowledge operations that violated international law, even if confronted with irrefutable evidence." William realized she was probably right. Governments rarely admitted to activities that could result in international sanctions or criminal prosecutions. But he also understood that the alternative, allowing foreign operatives to steal sensitive intelligence, was equally unacceptable. The countdown reached the 2-minute mark. In less than 2 minutes, the emergency destruction system would activate, destroying not only the sensitive current intelligence materials, but also any historical evidence that might support the operatives' claims about past operations. "Stop the countdown," the woman said. "We will discuss terms." William's finger moved toward the abort button, but Colonel Richardson's voice crackled through his radio with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Matthews, do not abort the destruction sequence without direct authorization from this command." He was now receiving contradictory instructions from different authorities, each with their own agenda and understanding of the situation. The operatives wanted him to preserve the evidence they had come to collect. The military command wanted him to destroy everything to prevent sensitive intelligence from being compromised. With less than 90 seconds remaining, William had to make a decision that would affect international relations, intelligence operations, and the lives of everyone in the vault. Looking at the faces around him, the operatives who believed they were seeking justice for fallen comrades, and the countdown display that represented his government's determination to protect its secrets regardless of the cost. William realized that some situations had no perfect solutions. He made his choice based not on political calculations or strategic considerations, but on his fundamental belief that truth and accountability were more important than institutional protection. With 30 seconds remaining on the countdown, William pressed the abort button. The destruction sequence stopped, the alarms fell silent, and the archive materials remained intact. In that moment of silence, everyone in the vault understood that the crisis had entered a new phase. The woman operative looked at William with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "Why? Because I think people deserve to know the truth, even when it's complicated and painful." Colonel Richardson's voice exploded through the radio. "Matthews, you have directly violated military orders and compromised national security." But William had moved beyond concerns about orders and protocols. He had made a decision based on his conscience, and he was prepared to accept the consequences. "Now what?" he asked the operatives. "Now we try to find a way to get justice without getting everyone in this vault killed." The sound of approaching military units was getting closer, and William realized that the most dangerous phase of the crisis was just beginning. His decision to preserve the archives had opened new possibilities for resolution, but it had also escalated the confrontation to a level where miscalculation could result in tragedy. In the end, the maintenance supervisor who had started his day worried about temperamental heating systems had become the central figure in an international incident that would change his life forever and potentially alter the course of diplomatic relations between nations. The story of that morning would remain classified for decades, known only to the participants and a small circle of government officials. But the consequences of William's choices would ripple through intelligence communities and diplomatic channels for years to come, proving that sometimes the most important decisions are made not by presidents and generals, but by ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and choose to act according to their conscience rather than their orders.